So, what do you think makes a really good podcast media host? What features would you want to have if you were designing that podcast media host? And better yet, what do you think makes a really good podcast? These questions and more on today's episode. Let's get started.
Sound matters. Be heard. Welcome to the podcast where you get exclusive behind-the-scenes tips to make your own show sound truly spectacular. This is Podtastic Audio.
Hey, what's happening? How are you doing today? I want to say thank you so much for being here. I am Chris, and I am from the original Chris and Christine Show podcast. You can find out every single thing about that show on a website. If you wanted to, you can go there at chrisandchristineshow.com. And guess what? Down at the very bottom of this podcast episode, there are some links, and one of those links, you guessed it, takes you right on over to chrisandchristineshow.com. But here is Podtastic Audio, the show which I have created to help you, help better create your show, because we all want to make a better sounding podcast, a better informative podcast. However you podcast, you can podcast or vodcast or do whatever you want to do. It's all your show. You can do it however you want to do it. But if you're having fun and you're enjoying the podcast journey, enjoying the podcast experience, then keep on keeping on. Now, aside from using YouTube as a podcast media host, there's lots of other places to physically hold your audio files and then get them distributed via an RSS feed to all the great, wonderful podcast player apps out there. But I do know that some shows or some people, they want to cut corners. They want to do things extremely cheap. So yes, you can go exclusively on YouTube and keep everything just on YouTube, like using YouTube as the podcast media host. Yeah, I do realize that is an option that a lot of people do. And they'll take maybe some short clips and some short reels and turn those into little segments that they can put on, say, TikTok, which is also free, Instagram, which is also free, Facebook, so on and so forth. If you want to stay in that whole video realm and just use YouTube as your one-stop shop for everything. But what I always say about putting everything onto YouTube or anything really is that if something were to happen with your YouTube channel or something were to happen where perhaps, maybe not saying it would, but let's just say perhaps that you get deplatformed from YouTube. It's happened for big names with millions of downloads, millions of followers. Big shows have been deplatformed off of YouTube before. Just because you're so massive does not mean you're immune to getting deplatformed. And if that does happen, and if all your content is on one-stop shop like YouTube, you lose everything. It's poof, gone. Even if you do keep, say, solid copies of the files on your hard drive or on a drive somewhere, that's great. That's wonderful. That's what you should be doing. But you lost all of your fans. You lost all of your community. You lost everything. Now, the advantage of having something like an RSS standard podcast is that if your RSS feed is sending your show to Apple Podcasts, and just to say that Apple Podcasts, for whatever reason, I don't know, loses your file, closes shop, I don't know, whatever. Let's just say you're accidentally removed from the Apple Podcast app. Well, don't you worry. There's Spotify, there's iHeartRadio, there's Pandora if they're still around. Anyways, there's a bunch of other places that your actual content can be physically consumed by the podcast listener, which in my opinion is one great advantage to having a standard, I like to call it podcast classic, which would be like your standard RSS feed distributed through a podcast media host to all the standard audio podcast player apps. Talking Apple Podcasts, Spotify, those are the two big ones, like 1 and 2. Apple's usually, first place and second place followed by Spotify. But there are a bunch of other places, yes, you can physically put your show on where people can listen, because not everybody listens to Apple and not everybody listens on Spotify. Yes, I get that. So if you can, I would say try to get your content out to as many places as possible. And yes, even including YouTube. Now, I know you're probably thinking, hey, Chris, this all sounds great and wonderful. So where do I start? Like, what do I do to get the ball rolling on this little podcast that I want to do? Well, you are going to need a podcast media host, a place to physically keep all of your wonderful files so it can be distributed to all the great, wonderful places. So today I have Danny Brown of Captivate.fm, which is a great, wonderful podcast media host, and more than just standard podcast hosting. They also do a bunch of other things. I was just perusing their website. I'm like, wow, you guys offer this, you guys offer that. And I'm like, that is good stuff because not a lot of other podcast media hosts even offer these things. And it's all wrapped up in a nice, wonderful package. I think what makes a really good podcast media host is for somebody who comes in who knows literally nothing about podcasting, nothing about any of this stuff. They can go in, set up an account, and if they have any issues or problems, the technical staff and support is there to help them. It's all written down in plain English. And then also, if say you want to monetize your show or get ads in place for your show, or maybe you want help building a website for your show and things like that, they make it all very easy. A one-stop shop for pretty much everything for your podcast, Captivate.fm. So please welcome Danny Brown to the show, talking all about podcasting and all about podcast media hosts. And hopefully maybe he'll convince me to switch over to Captivate.fm. So here's my conversation with Danny Brown. Okay, so here we are with Danny Brown of Captivate. Is it Captivate.fm? Is that what it is?
It is, yeah. It's the old FM radio station domain, if you like. But don't tell Mark I said that. Mark's the co-founder. Would take that.
Danny, when did you first get involved with podcasting? Like, when did you first start doing any of that kind of stuff?
So I obviously unofficially I got involved back in 2009. I did one single episode on Blog Talk Radio. And it was a live conversation. It was like a live interview with Chris Brogan, who's like a well-known social media guy, author kind of dude. And he just released the Trust Agents book, and he came on the show to talk about that. So I have the distinction of having one of the most listened to episodes on Blog Feed Radio of 2009. And it was the only episode I ever did. And then I left it. I probably then left it until 2017, I'm going to say. I used to just blog constantly, but I got tired of blogging, and I really enjoyed listening to podcasts. And I thought, I'm going to try this. So 2017, I started a little fun hobbyist podcast just for myself to see what it was like, etc., and been involved ever since.
So when you did your very first recording that in 2017, cracking the mic, getting up there and doing it, was it with a co-host or was it solo?
No, so back then it was solo, just myself, and this is how bad it was. It was just me talking into my MacBook speaker with no headphones or anything, sitting in an office with bare walls and bare floors, etc. It was, and glass, lots of glass. So you can imagine how quality-driven that show was. No, just me. It was me. The whole premise was, it was called Life Through a Dram, and the premise was it was me with a little dram of my favourite whiskey talking about something that happened that week, just basically life in general.
Now, when you recorded that very first episode, what was it feeling like when you decided to get up there and just press record and start talking?
Nervous, very, very nervous. As I mentioned, I really enjoyed, and I still do, but I really enjoyed listening to podcasts, and it sounded easy. And I'm sure you've noticed it before, Chris, where people say, "Oh, you podcast, that must be pretty easy. You just sit there and talk," and there's a heck of a lot more involved. So I sat down, I hit record, and I didn't know what to say. I didn't have any notes or bullet points or anything like that. I just wanted to freestyle it, basically. And it was awful. I must have rambled for about 20 minutes. And I'm not sure if I even released that episode because I didn't know about editing then, didn't know about sound production or anything like that. So yeah, very nervous, not knowing what I was doing, rambling.
So what software did you use to record it on your MacBook at that time?
I think it was GarageBand probably. Default GarageBand, it came with the Mac.
But you can still do some editing within GarageBand, I believe. Even then, you didn't even think to figure that out at that point?
No, I was one of these people that thought, I don't need to edit. People are going to enjoy this anyway. It's natural, it's raw, it's what you want. I learned quickly from that.
Well, going off the whole natural thing, I know if anything 2020 taught us is that there are a lot of quote unquote natural podcasts that kind of came out into the podcast space, and everybody's kind of like, we're just going to keep it real, man. We're just going to sit and do a Zoom chat and talk, and everyone's going to love what we're talking about because we're cool, or we think it's funny, or we think it's whatnot. So, in your best practices and things you've seen so far, what do you think are some of the mistakes that a lot of these, indie podcasters make when they first kind of get going?
I think maybe the main mistake is possibly to see Joe Rogan's success and his format where it's just two people in a room, maybe high, because we know Joe likes his little weed, and some of his guests do, and they're just like rambling and talking about anything they want. And he obviously gets millions, he's very successful. But the problem was he was already successful as a comedian, as a host, a sports analyst, etc., or a sports commentator. So he already had success and had an audience who were more forgiving and who were ready for that kind of approach. But I think a lot of podcasters are given wrong information by, unscrupulous people online, some consultants that saw a podcasting boom, saw there was some money in it with advertising, etc. But I'm going to get a piece of that, and gave them the wrong advice just so they could charge them, consultant fees or whatever. So I think they got a lot of bad advice, unfortunately. And we're told people will enjoy the content regardless. It's all about the content. And yes, content is super important, but podcasting is unforgiving because it is about audio. And obviously, video podcasting is involved, but primarily it's about the audio quality. And it's unforgiving. And listeners will only listen to your show for so long if it's not good quality that's coming out. Even if the content and the topics are really good, if the quality is unlistenable, they'll find someone else. There's plenty of other podcasters out there with the same topics, the same ideas, but just delivering it better.
Yeah, that's the thing. I was kind of say that, just because you're not the only person. I know a lot of these like movie review shows. I run in these circles. They always review some movie or whatever, And I was thinking that you're not the only show reviewing that movie. So you kind of have to do it in a way that's better than everybody else. And one way you can really stand out is having, better production than the two Zoom chat guys, drinking beers and getting, by the time the episode's finished, they're sloshed and they don't even know what day it is. Like the two guys in the basement, chit-chatting about whatever, and they're just like crack the mic, and the first thing you hear is like, hey, what do you want to talk about, Joe? I don't know. You want to talk about Mike? I don't know. We'll figure it out. I've been looking at my phone for 20 minutes and waste the audience's time. And I think, especially with YouTube, I just kind of noticed that if you look on YouTube and you watch the decent YouTubers, they really get straight to the point within the first 3 seconds. They are because they know on YouTube, if you're watching YouTube, you can easily leave one YouTube video and go to another YouTube video because they're all right in front of you. And YouTube, it's designed to get you to switch from video to video. That's probably why they put so much work on the great artwork, the great thumbnail for each video, because they want that to attract you to their video and get you to push play. And I heard somewhere that the retention rate on YouTube is less than 50% per video.
Oh, yeah, I could imagine. I mean, I look at my stats for YouTube. I don't really have a big YouTube channel. I've only recently started doing proper video, if you like. And I look at my retention stats, and it's horrible. Yeah, it's definitely, there's some videos get good retention. And I do tend to find that's obviously ones that have actually got me in the video, as opposed to static, upload from my audio shows or whatever. But yeah, I used to work at a marketing agency, and we'd have clients that had YouTube shows. And some were much better than others, just whether it was the host or the production or whatever. And you can tell right away, as you mentioned, the retention, the watch through, the drop off. YouTube has got an amazing level of detail, and it'd be awesome to see more podcast platforms say, I know Apple's got some great detail, Spotify has, but maybe more platforms like that give the same kind of granular detail that YouTube has. Obviously, YouTube has it like that because it's a siloed in-house on-platform.
Right, one-stop shop,
medium. Yeah, exactly. And obviously, podcasting's open source, so that's a big difference. But yeah, I mean, YouTube, the amount of data they've got to show you what's working, what's not, that's definitely something podcasters would really benefit from.
Yeah, and I know that a lot of podcasters, they go in the Apple Podcast Connect, and they go Spotify, things like that, and they can see kind of the same retention levels and things like that. And I've heard it's soul crushing if you find out, oh, everybody drops out in the first 3 minutes. What's up with that? But the funny thing is that you see your stats and it looks like, oh, I got all these downloads, but maybe they accidentally clicked on it for a minute or whatever, and then they bounced out. So, more than just looking at all these great numbers, like, oh, I got 1 million downloads. It looks great, but if no one's sticking around, then what's the point?
Well, that's it. There's been a big industry story, if you like, since October last year, when Apple the iOS 17 came out, and they changed the way they looked at auto downloads. So if you hadn't checked into your favorite show in the last 5 days or something like that, they wouldn't process auto downloads anymore, even if your app's got auto download switched on. So that's caused anywhere between a 15 to 30 to 40% drop in download numbers for a lot of podcasters who are now asking, why is my numbers dropped off the cliff? Well, A, they're actually more accurate now because they're only showing you actual listeners. But yeah, it's downloads is one of these dangerous metrics that a lot of podcasters go by, but generally that's just a starting point, because you can get a download that nobody listens to. It's when you go beyond that, as you mentioned, Chris, into listen, retention time, etc. That's a key number you want to be looking at.
Yeah, one of the factors I look into is actual feedback from physical listeners that either email me, message me, they write to me on social media, or emails, things like that. And that's kind of like, oh, well, this podcast, this episode has definitely gotten attention because people are telling me it was great, or they're giving me feedback on it directly. That's kind of how I kind of gauge things, out in the real world versus the, which I guess number of stats can be manipulated and things like that. They're not, they're as accurate as I guess we can have them be today, but still, I'm kind of like, well, are they all really listening, or are they all, or at least did they all listen all the way through? Unless you go into the finer details of the Spotify and the Apple Podcasts and things like that. So.
No, exactly. And that's what I look at in my episodes, because I use the free site that comes with Captivate. We obviously, like any podcast, gives a player. So anybody that listens on that player, I can track how long they listened to the episode, where they dropped off, did they skip, did they play, replay, etc. And that allows, same with Apple Podcasts, Spotify, etc. At least that allows you to now look at your content and tweak it. If people were constantly skipping your pre-roll, then maybe take away your pre-roll and stick that in mid-roll, for example. And if people are dropping off before the end, pull any call to action you've got at the end and drop that into 3/4 way through, etc. So it's, like you mentioned, you can talk all day about podcasting. I could talk all day about podcasting and data and analytics. I'm a geek for that kind of stuff. It really gets me, want to do better, if you like.
Yeah, well, that we always should want to do better. And I think with every episode that I create, at least for any show I do, really, I'm trying to find ways to make it better than the last show I just did. And as long as you're kind of striving to be better than the last episode, you're always going to be ahead of the curve, I guess, and make your show better, not just get kind of stagnant with just like a basic, same old,
Yeah, and that's where feedback, you get feedback from your audience, which is perfect. You can find out what they enjoyed about it, what didn't work, what did work, what they thought about episode X, guest X, etc. And again, it just continuously allows you to make these tiny little tweaks to give the best listening experience possible.
So you work for Captivate. Now, what is your job title there? What do you do there?
Yes, I'm the head of podcaster support and experience. So I head up the support team and work very closely with the marketing and the dev team about making the whole experience of the podcaster as good as it can be, whether that's the UX of the dashboard, the UI of the dashboard, the features that podcasters can use, how they can connect with their listeners, how they can monetize, etc. Really just making every touch point with Captivate, whether that's using the platform or even externally on social media or events or live webinars, etc. Just making every little touch point as good as and enjoyable as it can be.
Okay, so I have two podcasts, this one and the Chris and Christine Show podcast, and they're both hosted on different platforms, and I have a client show that's hosted on another platform. So how many of these podcast hosting companies are there out there?
Probably, for dedicated podcast and hosting companies, I'm going to say between 10 and 12 out and out just podcast hosting. There's more, there's probably between 20 upwards to 30 or so when you take into account maybe apps that have come online now that offer some hosting, or even distribution companies that now offer hosting, or remote recording companies that used to just be about remote recording and now offer some form of podcast hosting. So probably about a dozen dedicated, and then a little bit more when you take on other ones that now have hosting as an option.
Yeah. So when it comes to hosting, what do you say to the guy that says, yeah, I have a podcast. Oh yeah, where's it hosted at? YouTube. What do you tell that guy?
Well, I mean, if they want to call it a podcast, who are we to argue? It's all about, obviously, you get feedback from your listeners. So if your listeners, for example, say, well, I want to have your podcast on YouTube, and if you were old school and says, well, it's not got an RSS feed, so it's not really a podcast, mate, is it? You should be listening on Spotify. At the end of the day, who cares what it's called and where it's hosted? But for YouTube, yeah, that's definitely a video podcast. Not going to distribute your show to Spotify or Apple, Pocket Cast, etc. It's going to just purely be on the YouTube ecosystem. That may change down the line if YouTube really want to go up against like Spotify and Apple for that big chunk of the audience. But at the moment, it doesn't offer an RSS feed. They've only just started supporting RSS ingestion from podcast hosts, but it's still very much all on the YouTube ecosystem.
Speaking of YouTube, I had this thought the other day. I put out on Twitter or X. I had this thought, obviously most decent podcast hosts charge for the hosting fees to actually host the media files on their servers. What if YouTube did the same thing? Like, what if YouTube decided to charge for hosting for videos on their platform? I think the world would just explode. Everybody would just go nuts. Everybody would start crying. And I know the big shows wouldn't care. Like, whatever, what do we care? But I think that the smaller, people that are doing it as totally for funsy hobby, no money invested kind of thing, would probably lose their minds. I don't know what they would do.
I think what you probably see, Chris, is similar to what happened in podcasting space. You had obviously the paid podcast hosts, but for hobbyists that just wanted to test the waters, like me back in the day when I was testing that little single whiskey show, for example, I didn't have money that I wanted to invest in big equipment and podcast hosting, etc. So that's where the opportunity for 3 podcast hosts came along. So you had Anchor, now Spotify for podcasters. You had some of the paid hosts start to offer 3 plans. I think if YouTube did go down that route, you'd probably see another, for a freemium model, for example, you'd probably see someone else come along and offer. Maybe Spotify would then take that opportunity and really go for the video podcasting on Spotify and really go after that hard.
Well, I do. Okay, so you're in the podcast hosting space. So the hosting is saved on these servers somewhere. Where are your servers located, and where are YouTube servers located, and how big are they?
Yeah, so you pretty much find that most companies use global servers. So you might have some servers in the US, some in the UK, some in Europe, some in Asia, for example. I know Captivate, we've got multiple servers in different places in case one goes down or one has issues. So if AWS has issues, for example, we can switch over to another server, which is a backup to AWS and so forth. YouTube, obviously Google's probably got its own in-house, I would imagine, massive infrastructure. So it really comes down to where your user is, the end user. If they're in Europe, you'll probably get fed from the European servers. If they're in North America, they'll probably get fed from the North American servers, etc. And you're trying to make sure that you're forever optimized based on where you're located.
So if I came into you and say I'm starting a podcast, Danny, I want to use Captivate, can you tell me where my server is going to be for my files?
We could probably give you an estimation. It really depends, obviously where you're located and what's the most optimized one. Because it may be, even though you're in the US, it may be that the most optimized route based on who your service provider is for your internet, what your data plan, etc. So there's a whole bunch of weird behind the scenes that go into, okay, what's the upload speed like for this person when they're giving us files? Should we bump them to that server, this server, etc., to ensure that you've got the most optimized speed up?
Well, does it make a difference for, say, like I'm here in San Diego and if I upload to the closest server to me, let's just say it's LA for some reason, just because it's close, and somebody was in South Africa and downloaded my file, would it make a difference for them, or how's that work?
It shouldn't really make too much of a difference because it comes down to the data plan. But because they're downloading and most of the file is now hosted on the media host, and now they're essentially streaming that. So even though it's called a download, they're still streaming it unless they download the data to their phone. So
what are you trying to tell me? A download isn't really a download; it's more like a stream.
Yeah, well, unless you physically, it is a download, it's called a download, but unless you physically download that MP3 file to your phone or the device you're listening on, you're not downloading a hard file. So you're downloading the bits and bytes that go into that download, but it's the media host and then the streaming platform or the podcast platform, Apple, Spotify, etc., that's pushing that out to your device, and that's where your data is getting used. If you were downloading media files every single time you listen to an episode, you'd soon eat up a chunk of your data because you're downloading, say, anywhere between 50 to 150 megabits of data every single time.
Interesting. So if it's really kind of streaming and bringing it in, why don't we just use the term plays versus downloads?
You can probably do that. A lot of times when people come to us and ask what's the difference between a download and a listen, we'll say they're pretty much the same thing. The listener is where the difference comes in. So you've got a listener and then a download.
Okay.
So, but yeah, I mean, different platforms. Spotify calls it plays. Spotify calls it streams as well. Starts and streams, I think. Apple's got plays and listeners. And then obviously the podcast hosting companies have downloads and listeners.
Nice. So I know, like I said, there's a bunch of different podcast player hosting companies in the business. So what sets these guys apart from each other? Like, why go from company A, company B, that kind of thing?
It really comes down to what features are important to each podcaster. I mean, it's core base. Every podcast hosting company offers the same product. So they'll host your show. They'll allow you to publish episodes. They'll allow you to push that out to Spotify, Apple, etc. They'll allow you to track how successful it is with analytics and generally allow you some monetization features, whether that's with automated ads, sponsors, dynamic advertising, etc. So the core features are all the same. It really starts to, the differences come in when you really start to dig in and say, okay, do I have to pay extra for more improved analytics, for example? Do I have to pay extra for upload amounts? Some podcast hosts charge by the amount of hours you have each month to upload episodes. Some might charge you for using a custom domain on a free website, or extra team members if you've got like a client show and you want to bring your client on, plus a producer, plus yourself, plus maybe a data analyst for marketing analytics, etc. So really, do you have to pay for extra features? And then you've also got, are there any other features that say host A offers over host B that will either save me time in the creation process or help me grow, whatever that looks like. So grow my expertise, grow my brand, grow my business, grow my online course memberships, anything like that. So that's where the real difference comes in. A, do you have to pay for extra features? And B, what other features are super important to you that are only available on some hosts and maybe not others?
Okay, Yanni. So with Captivate, what is the base plan? What does it start at when you get with a base plan at Captivate?
Yeah, so the base plan, I mean, obviously it depends if you're in the UK, Europe, or the US. There's like the three currency models. But the base plan is the personal plan, which is either, let's stick with the US because I'm in Canada, you're in the US, so let's stick with dollars, it's easier. So it's $19 per month or $204 per year, which is if I remember, the equivalent of $17 per month. So you save a little bit if you pay annually. But basically every feature comes to all podcasters or is given to all podcasters from day one on Captivate, regardless of what plan. We charge by downloads only per month. So in the personal plan, you can have up to 30,000 downloads across all the podcasts that you have on your account. You can have as many public podcasts as you want, and 30,000 monthly downloads will be spread across these podcasts.
Okay. Well, yeah. A timeout on that. So you charge by the download, not by the usage?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it doesn't cost a lot to store media files.
What? Are you sure?
No, it doesn't cost a lot to store. Some people might tell you it does, but it doesn't really cost a lot. Storage doesn't cost a lot. Sure, if you've got like thousands and thousands and millions and even of media files, and they're getting up there to be super high bit rate at 320k bps and then 3 hours long or whatever, that's going to start adding up, obviously. But for the average podcast episode that's got maybe an hour long, 30 minutes to an hour, one person or two people, a little bit of music or whatever, the average podcast media file doesn't take up a lot of storage. So Mark and Kieran, who co-founded Captivate back in 2018 when it came out of beta, they always said that they would only pass on the hard costs to the podcaster. And the hard cost is storage. Like, it's hosting. But it's not super expensive to host files. So that's why we only charge by downloads, and that's a charge that we'll put across to our podcasters.
Why charge the other way around? Why charge for the upload or download, I guess?
Yeah, it's just different business models. It's one of the reasons we don't have a free plan. A lot of times we've been asked, well, other hosts have free plans, and that's just a different business model. We're attracting a certain kind of podcaster, but it just really comes down to the business plan. What do you want to charge for? Do you want to charge for X, Y, Z, that kind of thing?
So if you do have a show that's popular and it's getting over 30,000, now, well, on that note here, can you see what shows are getting that are on Captivate? Are you allowed to look at those metrics?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Okay, so so how many of the shows have you seen are getting over, or even at least close to that 30,000 a month download mark?
I wouldn't have that at the moment. Sorry, I thought you meant in general. So yeah, I don't have that open or anything. Sorry, Chris. But yeah, we could find out how many's got that. How many's got the over. Who's on the personal, who's on the premium, who's on the professional plan, who's on the business plan.
So if you go over the 30,000, you get kicked into the professional plan?
No, so we'll give you a couple of months grace if you like, because we know that there can be spikes. You might have like a viral episode. You might have a guest that shares it to 50,000 newsletter subscribers, whatever the case may be. So if you go over the 30,000 1 month, great. We'll just leave in your plan. You're good to go. If you go over consistently month 2 and it looks like you're probably going to go month 3 and beyond, we'll just reach out, say, hey, congrats on success. That's awesome. We think it might be time to move up to the professional tier. We can do it. We can just do it on your next billing section.
Now, has anyone ever given you flack about that? Said, "Hey, we don't want to do that. We want to stay on our cool little basic plan. Why you charge us more?"
Most people don't. You will get some pushback now and again, but that generally comes with where it is a genuine spike, a one-off spike, which is why we don't automatically just kick you up to the next plan. But another reason we charge by downloads, we feel, because the next tier up is up to 150,000 monthly downloads. So we feel that if you're a single podcast, or if your podcasts are getting beyond 30,000 downloads each month, you should be doing some form of monetization by them, either direct sponsorships or advertising or dynamic ads or anything like that. There should be some monetization in there because we do offer a lot of features for that. So that should cover the basic jump from the personal plan up to the professional plan. It's one of the key reasons for charging bound downloads, because as your show grows, obviously the monetization option should grow with it.
So, what is the next tier above? If you hit 30,000 to 150,000, what is the price point for that? Is it $150 a month?
That goes up to $49 a month.
$49 a month.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, but the all basic core features of the podcast host are all the same for each tier?
Yeah, everything's the same. There are some minor differences. So if you want a private podcast, for example, I know creators have private podcasts now for premium content. So on the personal plan, you can have 1 private podcast and 150 private subs. And professional, 2 podcasts and 1,000 subs. And then the business plan, 3 podcasts or 3 private podcasts and 5,000 private subs. You've also got, on the business plan, you can host limited client podcasts. And then the networks, we offer a network feature if you want to have a network for your shows, if you've got multiple podcasts. On personal, you can have 3 podcasts in the network. On professional, 6, and then on business, unlimited. But apart from these tiny little changes there, all the other features are available, yeah.
Now, when you say 3 or 4 or 6 different podcasts, are they 6 or 3 different RSS feeds, or are they the same RSS feed?
So they would be, for these ones, they're private podcasts, so they don't have an RSS feed.
Okay.
You can have as many public podcasts as you want, and every single podcast, public podcast, comes with its own RSS feed and all the features for that podcast.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've heard that too, where they say, I put all my podcasts, this host gives us unlimited different shows. And I said, great. I go check it out. And it turns out they're all dumped in the same feed, the same RSS feed. Well, anybody could do that.
Yeah. And that does cause problems as well down the line if you ever want to change hosts, because now you've got one RSS feed, but you've got, let's say you've got 10 podcasts, but you can only redirect that one single RSS feed to one show on your new host. So now the listeners of the other 9 shows are going to lose, unless you go in and manually update all the podcast apps with the new feeds for every single podcast that hasn't been redirected. So yeah, we always try to recommend people don't have multiple shows on one single feed.
Right. I say the same thing too, but I see they do it, especially with I seen a show of like years ago. They were on Anchor back in the day, and of course Anchor's all free, so why not just dump all of our? But they had like 7 or 10 shows on one Anchor feed, and because the guy was explaining it to me, on Tuesdays we do this show, on Wednesdays we do that show, on Thursday, like what? I am so because I went to go check out our show. And I just assumed the show that I heard on the day that I heard it, I guess that was the entire premise of the whole podcast. And it turns out he's dumping all these different things at me. I'm like, wait a second. You told me you put it all in one feed. I was like, whoa, wait, listen, more power to you, whatever. I mean, since Anchor at the time, as far as I know, well, they were still free and they were free. Why not do multiple free shows? I mean, they're all free. That cost you anything. So I don't know why the whole point was dumping it all into one free stream, like one free RSS feed. I didn't understand that, but more power to you, I guess. Do whatever you got to do.
It's probably because, with Anchor, yeah, they're all free, but you can only have, say, one podcast per account or one podcast per email account. So if you wanted the 10 individual podcasts on their own RSS feeds, you'd have to have 10 different Anchor accounts at the time. And I think it's probably the same for Spotify. You can upload, obviously, multiple podcasts now to Spotify for podcasters, each with their own RSS feed. But I'm not sure if you still need your own individual account for that. I'm not quite sure on that. But that's probably the reason he did that on Anchor at the time, for sure.
Oh, I gotcha. Nice. So it's $49 the top tier plan. Do you have something bigger than that?
Yeah, there's the business plan, which is for as it mentions, generally it's for agencies and producers or whatever that want to host client shows. So you would have a podcast production company or a podcast editing house or whatever you want to have it, or an agency, and you have multiple clients. So instead of them having their own accounts on Captivate, or if Libsyn were doing the same, or Buzzsprout or whoever, basically you would create a business account on Captivate. You would be the account owner as the agency owner, and then you would just create the podcast for your clients and then give them their own access as a team member. There would still be the podcast offer, etc. You just have the overall admin account to manage the show for them.
That sounds very interesting because I create podcasts for clients myself, and I was kind of wondering, like, a place to kind of manage each one separately. Not that I have a ton, but I'm saying, like, for that example, if I had, 5, 6, 7, whatever, different shows, I could literally have it all under one umbrella, but keep things separately from each other.
Yeah, exactly. And each client would only have access to their own show. So essentially it'd be like you having an office, and you've got 10 little offices within that main building, and every client's got their own office and their own key to that office, but they can't go into each other's office. They can only go into their own office, but you can go into every office and make sure everybody's okay.
Yeah, that's very important. And on that note though, I always say this to clients too, or new clients that want to come in. I always tell them, like, listen, I make sure that you set up your own podcast hosting, so it's under your credit card, it's under your thing. So if push comes to shove, like, you physically own the content, you physically own everything. So when it comes to that kind of stuff too, is it that the person who owns the credit card on file for that podcast owns the podcast?
No, so you'll be the account owner. But on the actual podcast, it would still have your client's name and their email address, etc., as the author and the owner of the podcast. If they want to take it over to their own paid account, they would just get in touch with our support team, and we'd help them do that. Obviously with your approval, you'd contact us, say, hey, Danny, or hi, Judy, etc. I've approved Jane to move to her own account. Just make it happen, whatever.
Yeah, but at the same time, I don't want to get in the way of that stuff, so I try to stay out of the loop, make sure they physically start up their own host. I mean, I'll get access to upload the files for them.
Sure.
But I want to make sure they have full control of that, because it's their, I feel like it's their property. It's their stuff. It's their show. If for example, they got big and started making some money, like, if I want to be a shady person, I can say, well, I'm going to take that money because I deserve it now, or whatever. I just don't want any of that kind of stuff to get in the way of that. So that's kind of the way I do it that way, I guess. Just make sure that everybody's, I mean, you want to trust everybody, I guess, and stuff. But I've heard horror stories. I don't know if you heard this I think Dave Jackson mentioned this on some of his shows, where, like, because he deals with Libsyn hosting and stuff, and how they go to look into their account and they say, well, we don't know. We let our editor set up that stuff. We don't have the credit card on file. I don't know what it is. And
right,
so I can't give you access to this account because you don't have the credit card and your name's not on here, your email's not on here, but it's our show. Well, actually, technically, it's not your show. It's actually the person who set the account up show. So I don't want to get in that messy business with that. So I always make sure that they, take care of that stuff on their own. So
Yeah, exactly. And it all comes down to the preference. I mean, if you wanted to have that side, then the clients would have their own, say, Captivate accounts, and you'd be involved as a team member then. So they'd add you as the producer or whatever permission they want to give you on the show, and you log in with your own password, etc., and just take care of the production side of it.
that's fantastic, man. I think that's a great way to do it because, I don't want to take full ownership of somebody else's stuff.
For sure, yeah.
It's not my house. I'm just kind of cleaning it for you, I guess. So it's been the living here. You live here, So it's like one of those deals. But
it's like the unwanted Airbnb guest that just won't leave.
Oh, definitely. Or say they lived in. They just. Do you guys have squatters up there? Because we have squatters down here where there's a house that's empty. People just move in and just never leave, and then it takes forever to get them out.
I don't know if if that's a thing in Canada. It may well be. I know certainly in the UK it was a big problem, and very much the councils and the law was on the squatter side as opposed to the homeowner side. So I know that was a big problem in the UK. Certainly when I lived there back in the day. I'm not sure if it's the same in Canada. I'd imagine it would be. It's pretty much similar everywhere, I think.
Right. So, hey, when it comes to podcasting, does Captivate do any kind of video podcasting hosting or just audio only?
Yeah, we don't. We're audio only. And we probably won't support, never say never, but we probably won't support video podcasting for two simple reasons. YouTube does it perfectly already. And the audience on Spotify, at least currently, Spotify for video anyway, is still pretty small. I think there's only about 100,000 video podcasts on the platform, which sounds good. But then you look at how many they've got, 4 or 5 million audio podcasts. So it's still a tiny part of the actual Spotify experience. So YouTube does it really well. And the podcasters that we have on Captivate that offers both video and audio, they just record as normal for YouTube, bang it up there, and then upload the audio version to us, send it out to Apple and Spotify, etc. You've got the best of both worlds then.
So speaking of video versus audio, it's like the big debate of all time when it comes to podcasting. So what are your thoughts on video versus audio?
I like it. I've just started experimenting with video. I've always been an audio only guy. I did do a video podcast, Tell a Lie, when I was back at an agency I used to work at in 2018, I think it was. And we did a marketing, myself and one of the co-owners did a marketing podcast, and that was video and audio. And that was fun. But I feel that you alluded to it earlier about the consumption time and the attention span of consumers of content on YouTube. You have to be so good at the creation of YouTube videos. You have to have the right environment. You have to have the right production value, the right sound, the right look, the right missions, if you like, with the transitions between the person speaking and then whatever's coming up as a special slide or whatever. There's so much has to go into that. So it's a huge part, and it's like a lot of people now do use YouTube as the background to audio podcasts. So yeah, I'm all for it. If you want to do YouTube video, go for it. Just be aware that to really succeed on YouTube, you probably have to put a lot more work in than you do on, say, an audio podcast when it comes to production values.
Yeah, and I mentioned this. I was on a podcast recently. I was just talking about this, how if you think about all the visual content that is available to all of us at any given time. I'm talking the big time stuff like the Disney Plus, the Netflix, like the movies, television, like really big production stuff that's anybody can have access to at any time versus your little YouTube Zoom show. At the end of the day, what are we going to be watching? You have to compete with that stuff. And I just from a competitive standpoint, I just can't see, or even just the regular, really good YouTube videos that are out there. You got to compete with those guys. And those guys are also, their stuff is force fed right in front of you on the screen saying, hey, look at me, look over here instead. Don't watch this thing, look at this thing. And so you have to keep them on your content without getting distracted by the other cute, colorful videos to the other side. Not to mention, I'm going to go to the movies tonight. Oh, not to mention the news is on. Not to mention, this new Netflix show came out. I want to check that out. Not to mention all that other stuff. So it's I think it's hard to really stand out and break through. I'm saying if you're going to do video only, I like doing video. I like doing both. I started doing YouTube videos long before podcasting even existed. And, I just put them up on YouTube or whatever, just for fun or whatever. Didn't think nothing of it. But when it came to actual creating content and this kind of stuff, I've always had like a radio background. I listen to more audio personally than anything else. So for me, it was just an easy thing for me to get into was audio podcasting. I might start to go into more video stuff later on. I have to get a better camera set up and get my camera everything kind of figured out and all that. So, it's okay for now. In fact, I'm looking, I don't know what to do with my camera. I fell behind my computer screen. I think about it where I went to. But I love video. I love stuff like that, but I just can't sit and watch on YouTube an hour talking head podcast unless they're physically showing other things happening on the screen at the same time. I think that's where a lot of these, I guess, quote unquote, video podcasters kind of fail, is where they don't physically like show other B-roll elements. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, that's where I definitely don't have the expertise to have a lot of things going on. Like the videos I put up now, it's just basically me either sitting in front of the camera talking and then switching to like a demo and a walkthrough of a platform or a cool AI tool or whatever. Or it's just to doing a purely like a static image, which is no good for anybody. But yeah, it's like, I always feel like YouTube it's an awesome sort of video podcasting. It's an awesome medium, and it's definitely got its fans and its audience. But I always feel that because, as you mentioned, for the whole attention span that you need and everything else that's going on YouTube at the same time for your attention, I always liken YouTube as a casual fling or a one-night stand where you might meet someone at a nightclub and go home with them, whereas podcast is more like that serious relationship that you want to get intimate, because it is that, even though you've got, say, thousands of listeners, it's still that very intimate one-on-one experience where it's a speaker and a voice into an ear. And it's very different approach and very different medium. I think that's where the two mediums are definitely separate from each other.
Yeah, I think with audio, you really feel like you're part of the conversation. You feel like you're connected with the host directly. I think there's more of a definite connection more with an audio podcast than a video show, I think. But some people might argue with me on that because video is everything. Video all day. And I think another thing about video with YouTube is that YouTube is so well known around the world, and it's so widely accepted and widely available. And my parents are older; they know how to work around YouTube, no problem. At least my mom does. But some people, older people, might have a difficult time figuring out how to work on a podcast app. But if you say it's on YouTube, they're probably easier to get to it and actually play it. So I do see the advantage of putting your content on YouTube, just for the fact that it's easier to access for most people, around the world. So, but Danny, one last thing here I was going to ask you about podcasting in general. So in your professional opinion, what do you think makes a good podcast versus, say, a bad podcast, at least in your opinion?
That's a good one, because there's so many reasons, I guess. I would say dedication and interest of the host. You can have the greatest equipment. You can have your room treated really well. You can have great editing skills. You can have great production values. But that's all secondary for me. It's the interest of the host that's doing the podcast. Do they really want to do that? Do they believe in what they're talking about? Do they have that enthusiasm where this is something that I would do whether I had 1 listener or 1,000 listeners or 10,000 listeners? I would do this every single day or every single week because it's what I love and it's what I'm passionate about. And that comes across. When you listen to a podcast, and it goes back to that intimate moment that we talked about earlier, where it's the audio, the intimacy of audio is very different from video. If you're listening to someone on a podcast and they're talking about the topic of the show or they're interviewing a guest, you can tell immediately if they're just phoning it in or if they're genuine about what they're talking about and who they're talking with and listening to that person. So for me, that would be the biggest, that'd be the difference between a good and a bad podcast. The host and his or her interest in what they're doing.
So basically, if they're disconnected from being there, you kind of tell whether someone's excited to be there versus they're just like, I just gotta clock in and do this stupid podcast today. So.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. And you can always tell. You can always tell. You mentioned 2020 when the pandemic came along, and we were talking about the basement. The guys getting drunk and just starting a podcast and then talking for 20 minutes and not really talking about anything. But you can tell, going back to that, a lot of people maybe saw the advertising money that got pumped into podcasting by Spotify, etc., who were buying exclusive shows, and by Amazon that were buying exclusive shows. So maybe people were thinking, I can make a lot of money with podcasts. I'm going to start one. Don't care what it's going to sound like. I'm just in it. I'm going to put a podcast out and start making money off ads, etc. And I feel that's where maybe some bad podcasts come about from, that period. But yeah, just the interest factor, and not the interest, because you can listen to a podcast about the mating rituals of snails in Alaska. Now that might be super exciting. I don't know, and I don't even know if there's snails in Alaska. Maybe it's too cold. Who knows?
Yeah, that's the whole point.
Right?
That's the gag. That's a gag.
If you've got a host that is so passionate and knows everything about the different snails and why it's important for the yellow-bellied tip-top snail to not be on mating call during the months of July to September in Alaska, because that's when polar bears actually want the morsel as a side dish. I don't know what I'm talking about here, Chris, but it's something like that. I could listen to the most boring topic if you like. As long as the podcast host has got that passion and that interest and really loves what they're doing, I will listen to that show.
Yeah, I think that's to do with the presentation. I think I mentioned this a while ago on an episode where like your presentation is almost anything. Like if you think of a good comedian, they will, even if they're just saying simple things, you're just like laughing. You're like, I don't know why I'm just cracking up. It's their presentation. It's like how they present themselves, how they talk, their monotone, the way they do it, it's just, they bring the show. And I think more than just reading something you wrote down or pages or in a book, just reading it into the microphone, I think bring a little energy, bring a little enthusiasm to your audience. I think the more enthusiasm you have, the more excited the listeners are going to get to listen to you.
Well, yeah, exactly. And that all ties back to growth. If you really value your listeners, and most podcasters do, there's some that might just be in for the money, who knows? But for the majority of most podcasters do. But yeah, if you really value your listeners, you want to make every experience a great one. And you were talking earlier about how you look to improve every single episode, whether that's by feedback or improving something that didn't quite work with the previous episode, etc. That's where an audience goes and pays money to go listen to a comedian or go watch a comedian. While an audience might not pay for a podcast, they do pay for it with their time. So we should give back and want to make sure that the time they're spending with us, as opposed to elsewhere, is time really well spent, that they feel that they got great value for 5 minutes, an hour, 3 hours, whatever the time is for that episode or show.
Well, Danny, thank you for giving me your time today. I really appreciate you stopping by today,
You're
man.
welcome. Thank you.
Hey, so Danny, where can everybody find out all about you and all your wonderful stuff?
Yeah, so the main places I'm still on Twitter. I refuse to call it X. Sorry, Elon, but I'm Twitter all the way through. I will never ever call it X. So yeah, I'm on Twitter at Danny Brown CA. You can catch my podcast, 1 Minute Podcast Tips, at 1minutepodcasttips.com. And then if you're interested in Captivate, you can always find us at captivate.fm.
Fantastic. Well, Danny, you have a fantastic, and stay warm up there in Canada the rest of your day, man.
Thank you very much, and enjoy your t-shirt weather in San Diego.
I want a t-shirt right now, speaking of which.
There you go.
Hey, thank you once again for listening to this episode today. I really, really appreciate it. That makes me smile so much. But you know what would make me very happy is if you gave me an honest review on your favorite podcast player, whether that's Apple, Spotify, Joe Blow's House of Podcasts. I don't know which one you use. But if you could give me an honest review about the show that I've created to help you, that would be awesome. Thank you so much. And I will catch you on the next episode.